Okay, today we are going to talk about Chapter 6, Lesson 2, all about the Israelite kingdom. So, in around 1100 BC, the Israelites come to Canaan, right? And they're trying to settle there. They're doing pretty well. They've created an alphabet and a calendar based on a lot of the ideas in the area, the Canaanite ideas. Remember, they have been fighting with the people that are there to kind of carve out a space for them. The Philistines, especially, are an enemy, and that they keep moving inland and challenging the Israelites for land. And so a lot of the Israelites are starting to say, we need to band together. Remember the 12 tribes from Jacob's family, right? So the 12 tribes have been kind of independent. We need to band together and work together to go into battle and beat the Philistines. And so they're asking for a king to unite them. And not everyone thought that was a good idea. But anyway, and some, in fact, actively said, you don't want a king, right? They'll end up taxing you and enslaving you and things. But they chose Saul to lead them. And Saul won many very battles against the Philistines. I have a video for you all about them, but eventually he ends up losing God's favor and ends up being replaced as king. He actually dies in battle, and then they replace him with David. So there's a big history here between Saul and David. David, remember, is the same David from David and Goliath, where he beats this huge Philistine Goliath who was bragging he could beat anyone. And so little David, beats him with only a slingshot. Actually, in reality, I believe they say they have more than a slingshot, but it's the slingshot that, hits him in the head, Goliath in the head. Notice in this painting, right, they have exaggerated the sizes, I'm sure, and painting the Philistine to look like a big monster, right? All right, so he was just a shepherd, and he got a lot of attention for his bravery. He actually worked for Saul as a soldier, and he became very popular. He was part of the group that drove the Philistines out of Israel, and he got so popular that actually Saul was really jealous of him. He wanted to be the one that everyone, looked up to. And Saul actually tried to kill him, and, David had to go out and avoid, being hunted down. David, again, also was responsible for making Jerusalem the capital city. And after Saul's death, he becomes the king and does a very good job as king. He also was known to be a fine musician, and they believe that they attribute a lot of the Psalms to him. In the book of Psalms. Psalms is a sacred song or poem. It's kind of like a prayer that you sing to or chant to. They believe that a lot of the Psalms supposedly were written by David. And he, unites the tribes and is this prosperous king who did a good job. One of the things they did during this time period is they start using terraced fields. Remember, they have those rocky, not great land. And so they want terraced fields, means that you're cutting into the land kind of like stairs instead, so that you can keep the soil from going down the hillside in rainy times. That it's really helpful. So you'll see often in hilly areas where they're trying to farm, they cut these kind of stairs into the fields. It's called terraced fields. So David is known as being this wonderful king, and he's, held up as being one of the greatest kings ever. Okay. All right, some other early kings that we should talk about is Solomon, who was actually David's son. He becomes the next king, and he also leads them through a very nice period of peace. He builds up trade and treaties with other people. He is also accredited with building the first temple. So it's either called First Temple or Solomon's Temple, both of them. This is like a permanent building. Remember how before they had always carried around the Ark of the Covenant and had a temporary, so now he's built a permanent building. And he had a lot of other building projects too. He also was very famous for his wisdom and wise sayings, which are called proverbs, that were written down. And so they say a lot of these wise sayings that were written down were done by him. This picture is a dramatic one of showing one of the famous sayings or kind of like a ruling by Solomon. This is one of my favorite stories I remember as a kid. In it, two mothers come and say that there's a baby who died, like rolling over the baby probably, or suffocation, right? Crib death probably. And the two mothers both are claiming that the live baby is theirs. So you can see there in a very dramatic fashion. Okay, and so I'm not going to tell you the outcome of how he decides which mother is the real mother of the live baby, but you'll have to watch the Edpuzzle to find out about that one. He also, unfortunately, got unpopular with the people towards the end because he had so many building projects. He had to raise taxes, and of course, no one likes high taxes. And so, he got unpopular, unfortunately, towards the end. Okay, so what happens is after Solomon's death, the tribes decide to split up. And they split up politically, right? They're still the same religion, but they make two politically different regions. So these two kingdoms, one is called Israel, and it's in the north. And it is going to be 10 of the tribes are going to live up there in the northern part. And they make the capital Samaria. And then Judah is going to be in the southern part. And Judah is the two southern tribes, and they make their capital Jerusalem. Okay? And so these are the two kingdoms that are going to rule for a while. And they, of course, are small kingdoms. So they are getting threatened by outside empires that are forming by the Assyrians and the Chaldeans, which we've talked about previously. So unfortunately, they, of course, are going to get invaded. And so Israel is first. Israel gets invaded by the Assyrians. And remember, we've talked about how the Assyrians were really rough. And if you didn't pay the tribute right away, they would destroy your towns and burn everything and take all your valuable goods. And then they would force your... when they beat you, they would take a lot of the people and force them to move to different places. So that's what happens to Israel. They get invaded in 722 BC. They, unfortunately, of course, Assyrians are really good, and so they capture a lot of the cities, including Samaria, the capital, and they force a lot of the Israelites to leave and go and live in other parts of their empire. So that is going to be basically the end of Israel as it was. What happens is when the Assyrians make some of them leave, they also bring in some other, people from other areas they've conquered. So there ends up being a mixture of different cultures, and over time, they adopt each other's ideas. So, and it kind of makes a new culture. And so this new culture are called the Samaritans. And you may have heard of the Samaritans mentioned in the Bible. So that is that new mix. So they have some of the original Israelite beliefs, but they also mix with some others. So like today, the idea of Judaism that we know about, that is not going to be from here, because this area, has this outside influence, and they don't keep those original ideas completely. So when you think of Judaism today, you're thinking of it from the second kingdom, Judah. So Judah also has trouble. They actually had survived the Assyrian conquests, but then the Chaldeans come in about 597 BC. And remember, the Chaldeans, were ruled by Nebuchadnezzar. And so at first, when the Chaldeans came in, they said, actually, we're gonna have a bunch of you leave. That was the common thing, right? Force thousands of them to leave Jerusalem and go live in Babylon, which, remember, Babylon was the name of the capital of Chaldea. Or then they called it the new Babylonian Empire. Remember? So at first, then the people that he left, though, he let them have one of their own people rule. Now, it was supposed to be like a puppet king, right? Like at first, this Judean king answered to to Nebuchadnezzar, but he was one of their own, was allowed to rule them. Well, unfortunately, this king decided he was going to rebel, and the prophet Jeremiah tried to tell him that that's not what God wanted, but he didn't listen, and they rebelled. And of course, the Chaldeans do not like that they're being challenged, and that, how dare you rebel against us again. So that this time they retake Jerusalem and they destroy almost everything in Jerusalem, including their first temple there. So then they, as punishment, capture that king, and they take him and thousands more to Babylon. And so this is called the Babylonian exile, when they are forced to leave their homeland and live somewhere else. And they spend about 70 years in exile. So obviously, we're talking, new generations are eventually going to come back. But this generation is forced to try to live and keep their ideas in a foreign land, and we'll talk about that next time.